continuations of our past meeting and last week. So we're gonna have like the third sessions and also the fourth sessions. The third session has we're gonna discuss about the Cold War geopolitics and geostrategy. Will begin at 8:30 up to 10 a.m. And then we're gonna have like a 10-minute break and then followed by the fourth session. And follow streams, we actually have this meeting, but then it will help online after Dr. Max go back to the US. So probably we'll have like after we'll discuss together after this week, and then probably next week we will still have continue again the last part of the sessions. We're gonna talking about the political. Okay. So, without further ado, invite our speaker, Dr. Maxim Samson. So, the time is yours. Give a round of applause to him. Thanks a lot, Lucky. Yes, as you heard, so today we'll be looking at geopolitics, and then after that, the second class of today, we'll be looking at the post-Cold War. How geopolitics and geostrategy have changed since the Cold War, but also how there are certain similarities. And then remotely, like as I mentioned, maybe next week or whenever it will be, we'll look at the Asia Pacific region so much, I guess like directly. Although I think there are some important aspects of the next two classes which are also very, very relevant to Indonesia. So and I'm not going to speak everything, but I will just reiterate a few key points. As we heard, geopolitics and geostrategy, we need to really understand why countries seek to control or have a role, have some kind of influence in certain places. Most countries are everywhere. Most countries don't have the resources, don't have the ability to affect politics every single country. So, geostrategy, countries will select very specific places. And if we have a lot of competition over the same places, we see that potentially leads to tension and even conflict. There are some parts of the world, quite frankly, which are seen as more important than others. And that's something we need to really focus on today. We also heard about class about the role of ideology and the ability to maps very certain viewpoint and to shape our perspective. All of the material I think that we covered last week is going to be relevant today as well. I think we'll really see how maps help countries to really have an influence and to shape opinions. We will also see how different countries have very specific vision of the rest of the world and will seek to control certain places and bring them under their influence. But to start off, I wanted to actually ask you a couple of questions. And these are very subject. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in your own opinions. My first question to you is, several countries want to control certain places more than others. Why certain countries? Does anyone have an answer to that? I appreciate any answer that you might provide. Why do countries control certain places? Silakan ada yang mau mencoba menjawab apa suatu negara itu prefer terhadap lokasi tertentu dibandingkan dengan negara yang lain. Mikrofon yang satu di mana? Tadi itu
Oh, itu apa?
Silakan. Oh, coba coba. You can rely on you. Bisa bisa. I think certain places refer to strategic place like trade routes or country with good natural resource because the powerful countries fight for influence to control trade routes and everything. Fantastic answer. Any, if I may ask a follow-up question, in particular natural resources, which they are especially any kinds of natural resources that we know that countries really want. So I agree. Countries definitely look for places with lots of natural resources. But which natural resources are most important to all now? Maybe historically. Why for centuries was Indonesia such European power, for example? For centuries, Europeans loved coming to Indonesia to try and extract especially one natural resource which they sell back in Europe. The other resource that was spices. But which spice in particular? There's one spice especially Europeans loved. You're right, that's the humble today. Nutmeg. Europeans loved nutmeg. Is it the same word here? No, it's different. So we call pasta pala. Pala, okay. Europeans really loved it. There's a story where I don't know if any of you are familiar with the island of Boon. At least in English we call it Boon. Quite an obscure island in Indonesia, I think. Um, You know, Manhattan in New York was originally colonized by the Dutch. British and the Dutch fought islands. The Dutch had control of Manhattan, the British had control of Rouen. The Dutch thought they had a great deal by claiming Rouen off the British. That was how powerful and expensive it was. In the end, of course, Manhattan becomes the center of New York, and York becomes New York. So, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe the British kind of developed more Manhattan. But I think that story shows just how important spices were to Europeans. Like the British and the Dutch were really involved in Indonesia for a long time. Likewise, the British, in particular, really loved going to India, really wanted to control places. These days, spices aren't as valuable. What kinds of resources now are most valuable to country? Maybe in the past 30, 40 years. I said it's one of that resource that powerful countries are really interested in claiming. What do you say is the main natural resource we see conflict over nowadays? I heard someone say oil. I mean, that's what I'm thinking of. Why do we see so much conflict in regions such Gulf region around sort of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iran, partly we know there's sort of religious division, but a large part of the reason why countries like the United States and Russia and multiple other countries have become so interested in the Middle East is because of oil. Oil is needed for so many things as a fossil fuel. So, oil, another kind of resource that powerful countries want to get. And interestingly, countries like the United States and Russia both have their own oil reserves anyway. They already have oil. But someone like Saudi Arabia has a huge amount of oil. So we see a lot of interest amongst powerful countries involved in the Middle East. Now, I would argue that now, being another resource perhaps about to become even more popular, and that is maybe the most simple of all, and that's fresh. We know that with climate change, we're quite short actually in many ways of good quality fresh water. And I think it's quite possible we'll see more conflicts this century or over water, controlling water resources. There have already been quite a few conflicts, especially in parts of Africa, where some countries kind of have major rivers and water shortages, warmer climate, possibility of desertification, places turning into desert. Also, is going to, I think, the other important natural resource is it. Now, resources are one thing. I think there's another thing actually. Is like how countries want to make certain things. We alluded to it last time. I mentioned it briefly. And again, this is where intermediate development, and that's trading route. Countries often want to claim places where they're convenient movement is lots of trade place in the same specific places. So the history of Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore, somewhere like the Straits of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, these are very important. And so countries want to have a stake, they want to have an impact. This is partly why it's so important for major powers to develop canals, Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. Again, it speeds up trade, but it also means that you can avoid some of the rivals. The British really wanted, for the Europeans as a whole, really wanted the Suez Canal. A lot of their rivals were around the Ottoman Empire or around sort of the descendants of the Ottoman Empire. And control having, sorry, the reason why you the Indian Ocean was because going by sea around Africa meant they could avoid the Ottomans and powerful rivals. It gave them an alternative instead of relying upon Ottoman bases, which sometimes would compete with Europeans. But controlling trade routes is also really important, and we're seeing that today as well. So countries such as India and Russia and Azerbaijan are developing their own routes over ground in order to kind of bypass many other countries, especially countries that don't get on with very well. So trading routes. Does anyone have any other? Don't have to answer. Anyone else have why countries try to control certain places? We have a second question, and then I'll move on. Well, number one, if you have an answer, I'll let you. Why do powerful countries want to control more than others? So basically, it's a matter of the price. I mean, certain country want to prove to the world that they are super, so they will have more influence. Influence can be diverse in diverse form. The example is they can have a lot of territory. The second is influence in politics, and the third influence in, for example, in whole they apply the language. For example, why the universal language right now is English, even though not considered as the naturally the most spoken language on earth. For example, China or Mandarin should be the majority of people who speak Chinese. But then because of China only for the country and they don't have any territory outside of China, so I believe they prove to the world that they are. Yeah, I think a really great answer shows us that controlling places isn't just about physical resources. In fact, a lot of it is always symbolic. It's more kind of cultural or symbolic influence, where one country can say, look how much we have, look how big we are. This is very true again of many colonizers. I've been reading recently a lot about the Portuguese Empire. The Portuguese Empire was really weak by European standards by the 1880s, but they would publish maps showing their colonies such as Mozambique and Angola, which are pretty big countries. And they would say, look how big we are. You can take Angola and Mozambique and put them on Europe, and they cover a lot of it. And in reality, the empire was relatively small, but they could say we control these big territories. It's true in the expansion of countries like the United States. Part of it was about sharing religion, spread Christianity. Part of it was making the country. They only seemed to be more powerful as countries, so they liked it as much. And regarding culture and religion, you see so many conflicts in history. I think it's something like the States in Europe. A lot of it was just in certain nations trying to kind of claim, again, places such as Jerusalem, trying to claim holy sites as a way of trying to turn them into religion. So I think there's a lot of different ways we see this play out. I think language, as you say, English versus Chinese. There are more speakers of Mandarin Chinese than English in the world, but most people who speak Mandarin in China, most people in USA, Australia, Canada, English majority language majority countries don't speak Chinese. But a lot of Chinese speak it. I think that goes to show the continuing language in these states. I have one other question, few more subjects, by the way. What, in your opinion, is the most important part of the world to control? You imagine you are the leader of a powerful country and you want to affect as much of the world. What region do you focus on? Oh, silakan, ada yang mau mencoba menjawab. Jadi, menurut kalian ini secara subjektif ya. Jadi, tempat mana sih yang dianggap paling penting representasinya dari pusat terhadap dunia ini? Mana yang menurut pendapat kalian yang dibaca ya? Let's give it a hand up. Thank you. I think the area that I will control is Malacca Strait because Malacca Strait is going through that strait. So I'll probably going to uh, yeah take that place, and also a lot of canals like the Suez canals and Panama canals. Also the new one, the northern one, Canada. I think because the global warming is going to be a warm water one. Anyway, so I'll take one. Yeah, and a lot of explorers always wanted a northwest passage to Canada, maybe in the future. But clearly a focus on trading routes for you, so say Malacca Straits, Panama, Suez. Can I just get a show of hands that you would agree that you would, let's say Malacca Strait, you would aim for the Malacca Strait number one region? Study. You just if you agree that the Malacca Strait is the number one most important. Yes. Just asking anyone, put your hand up if you agree. No. Do this as a vote. Does anyone have a different answer? Maybe we've got different opinion. Thanks so much. I think it's a really good answer. I'm curious if anyone has a different answer. What region would you control? Your chance. Your power. Who wants to be a superhero? Now, misal saya menjadi presiden Amerika, ya mengontrol wilayah yang ada selatnya seperti selat Suez, terusan Suez, selat Hormuz. He said like phosphorus. Yeah. Like it was considered. Yeah, I think it's so it's full of phosphorus. I think another really good answer. A huge amount of trade again takes place going around that area, the eastern Mediterranean. So phosphorus, Turkey has a lot of power. A lot of countries are very interested in Turkey because it's right between Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. Really, these very powerful states are very interested in that. Who agrees with the phosphorus? Anyone to share the opinion other than phosphorus and also interested if there are any other. I have to say, I agree with both of you. I think one country that's really influential, I think is about to be really influential at the moment, is Saudi Arabia. On Saudi Arabia as well. There's a huge number of mega projects being developed there. Part of the aim is because part of the reason is just that Saudi Arabia is remarkably close to the world's population. Within 4 hours, I'm trying to remember the percentage, I want to say it's something 4% of the world can fly to Saudi Arabia within 4 or 5 hours. So it's very central and has obviously huge amounts of money with its oil well, now trying to actually diversify. So I think it's another interesting region. Now, what I think is we see that although we live in a globalized world, where the internet is really powerful, and single trade remains incredibly important. All of these answers discuss sort of trade, actually moving physical objects. We often hear that we live in a digital world, and we do, but actually there is still a lot of importance to moving objects and items. But clearly we have to recognize it, obviously in this sense, controlling routes is very significant. To move on, if anyone has any final remarks on this. Okay, so to understand today what geopolitics and geostrategy, it's definitely worth considering the influence, one of the most interesting periods in history when it comes to geostrategy. And as these cartoons demonstrate, we often talk about the Cold War being a bipolar world. In other words, a world controlled largely by two main powers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, USSR. So USA and USSR as two main superpowers. Now, before we talk about that further, I actually want to present a little bit of theory which relates to what I just asked you. Because this idea of what world you control has long been discussed by many people. And one of the most influential theories is called Cold theory. This is older than the Cold War. It was developed in the early 1900s by a geographer who published a paper in the Geographic Society in Britain. It's called Halford Mackinder. He argued that to divide the world, broadly speaking, into 3 or 4 regions. Most importantly, he highlights world island, and he means world islands Europe, Africa, and Asia. And within the world island, actually, before I come on to that, why is the world island important? A lot of it is to do with population. He noticed that at this time, 87% of the world lived in these regions. So, although there were many continents, many places, in just Europe, Africa, and Asia, 87% of the world is living. So most people in the world live on the world island. The world island is also home to the most resources, most natural resources. He estimated that about 50% of known natural resources exist on the world island. So you have most people and most resources. So therefore the world island is the most important region. But within that, specified there's one part of the world island that is more important than any other. And that region focused attention on Eastern Europe. That whoever controls the heartland controls the world island. If you control the world island, that was his argument. If you control Eastern Europe, you control the world island. And if you control the world island, you control the entire planet. And he predicted that most geostrategic attention would be centered on Eastern Europe for that reason. Why Eastern Europe? Well, there are quite a few reasons, but a lot of it is related to it being the centre of many of the major powers of the time. And still, a lot of European empires in existence, groups such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was still around, still seeing, of course, the British Empire is very important, a number of different empires in Europe. We also have, in 1904, the Russian Empire was in existence. There's still the Russian royal family, or the Communist Revolution, and the Ottoman Empire, although declining, still exists too. We have European empires, Russian Empire, and the Ottoman empires. Where do they meet? They meet in Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe is the most important place. You may say that reflects a certain European bias, and I agree. I think what we can always see is that people often choose what they're familiar with. As a European, stands to reason, you'll be biased towards Europe in that sense. Maybe a scholar from a different country, let's say Japan, Indonesia, would have a different opinion. But for him, Eastern Europe is the place that countries. Now, what's interesting to me is when we look at the history of the Cold War, what's one of the main centers of the Cold War is Eastern Europe. So in that sense, I think he was right about quite a lot of things. He also described other places. He thought interestingly, described the USA as a peripheral nation. He described it as being fairly irrelevant. So bear that in mind as well. Back in 1904, British geographer didn't think the USA was that important. Nowadays, we probably see it most important country or most influential country. 1904, not so important. Talk about that more next class. So as I say, whoever controls Eastern Europe controls the world. And one of the most famous examples of someone who took this theory as part of their politics was Adolf Hitler. Hitler used this theory as the part of the basis of the nation in Eastern Europe. Hitler recognized that if he wanted to control Europe, he needed to control Eastern Europe first. Partly why Nazi Germany originally would invade countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland, and then later Russia, even though Russia was an ally at the time. Hitler recognized that Eastern Europe is really important to strategy. So his attention was originally on Eastern Europe. And this later, as I say, becomes the basis. Cold War is fought in many different countries across the world, but perhaps no region of the world was as important to the Cold War as Eastern Europe. So bear in mind. So what we have as the basis of the Cold War geopolitics and strategy is ideology. What is ideology? Well, it's really a system of ideas and ideals. How we think about the world and what we want the world to look like, what we want the culture of the world to be like, what we want to take place. So there are different ideologies around the world, and these can be quite based in religion, for instance. We might describe as a Christian ideology, a Sharia Muslim ideology, but it could be more of a political or economic ideology. Capitalism, communism. It could be again related to politics, conservative, liberal. So a system of ideas and ideals. And what it does is it tries to define how a society should function. So if you want, let's say, a Sharia society, you impose certain laws that people follow. If you want a liberal democratic society, likewise, you have certain institutions developed in order to fulfill that ideology. And what this means is power is very important. Whoever is in charge define ideology. You are the government, for example, kind of elite, can define your ideology. So it's a particular perspective on the world. What means you to be correct, it's quite subjective. Opinion. We also have to recognise sometimes what an ideology said isn't reflected in how people actually live their lives. Individuals might not live their lives in accordance with the government ideology. Three, they might not think it's as important as the government thinks. So within as well as between societies, we see a lot of tension over ideology. And again, this is important to the Cold War, where certain countries get the capitalist. There are a number of countries where major wars were fought. I mentioned Mozambique and Angola before. There are two examples. There were communist and capitalist powers. Broadly speaking, there were other factors as well. Divided them. In Asia, Vietnam, the countries split, and in the case of Korea, still is split between a capitalist. So we see that ideology is very important in dividing. So the Cold War takes place after World War II. As a very quick background to World War II, we see that World War II is largely fought on the basis of ideology as well. So World War II is very much an ideological war. Broadly speaking, we can say there are three main ideologies. We have most famously associated with Nazi Germany, but the word fascist is actually from Italian, fascismo, and was associated with Mussolini in Italy and Japan. These are the three main fascist countries during World War II, and they were all allied. At the bottom, we have communism, a different kind of authoritarian regime. So, also authoritarian, but quite different, far left as far goes far right. And originally, Germany and Soviet Union were allies. They appreciated each other. Politics in some ways, but they also, crucially, I mentioned Europe. We have what is called France, which is very much kind of under the fascist sphere of influence. So fascism, democracy, are the three main ideologies behind World War II. And what these different groups are trying to do influence more advanced European countries, later the USA when it joins the war, interested in trying to protect it. So we can see this in terms of the maps of the time. This map on the left is Europe in 1942. See, there's a huge amount as well as German allies. So almost all of Europe you can see is under sort of German influence. It reflects German ideology. There are a few independent states, states are Sweden, Ireland, Spain, Switzerland. And there aren't many countries which oppose Germany at this point. Really just Great Britain, Soviet Union. But it reflects these different ideologies. We have most of Europe is under fascist ideological control. Britain is liberal democratic state. USSR, yes. Here's a map showing these different visions. And Germany trying to make all of Europe eventually a fascist continent. Now, on the right, we have an imagined alternative post-war Europe. So this is what the Nazis Essentially, what we're aiming to do, and especially what's going on? Basically, and I know I'm jumping on a bit in time, but it makes sense, I promise. Um, Before World War II, of course, much of the world was defined by imperialism. This is a map of colonial empires in 1914. It doesn't color code it, but you might be able to recognize imperial power, which color. So on this map, as usual, pink means Britain, purple means um, pale green means Germany, not purple means Belgium, red means Portugal. And there are some other countries here as well. They're kind of the main powers as of 1940. So we see that different European countries, especially, are trying to colonize parts of the world. There is also just one major exception to the European power. Japan. We can see Japan in the east has by this point claimed control of Korea and eventually tried to Manchuria. So it's an imperial system. Now after the war, after World War II, as the Cold War begins, we start to see decolonization. We see a huge number of countries gain their independence in a very short time. So this map at the bottom, three nations between 1946 to 1975. Which two regions of the world see the most decolonization here? Anyone tell me? On the way. What's the main region of decolonization after World War II? Silakan. Alam Islam memaparkan wilayah mana sih yang itu yang paling ini juga di memaparkan mengenai alasannya. Mau mencoba menjawab lagi dari decolonization. Colonialization itu kan proses saya dampak ya dari baiklah negara-negara yang jauh itu terdiri bagian Afrika dan juga ada yang untuk alasannya mengapa merdeka setelah itu karena dekolonialisasi. Untuk dekolonialisasi itu adalah pemberian negara jajah. So since I like agree with the majority of the countries in the African continent and the northern part of South America and also northern Asia such as Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. But then the meaning of decolonization is said mostly about bring from colonial period to the more written people bring on. Yeah, excellent. Thanks so much. And it makes sense in a way. You look at the map at the top, and most of the colonies are in Africa, South and Southeast Asia. So it kind of makes sense that a lot of these places getting independence. But it is really, I think, noticeable seeing almost all of Africa by 1975 gets its independence. So we see this huge change. As you say, we also see South and Southeast Asia. Indonesia gained independence after World War II. What are we seeing here? Mind what I mentioned earlier. With the onset, the start of the Cold War, I think we're seeing three main regions emerge as important geostrategic. I mentioned Eastern Europe before. Important according to our theory, important during World War II. Center of much of the conflict of World War II. But with decolonization, we also see two new regions emerge as important Cold War. Africa, look at all of these new independent countries ready, major powers trying to control. Under imperialism before, but that doesn't mean they're not completely able to do what they want. They're new countries, new governments, sometimes unstable because the imperial power made them. Portuguese Empire, for example, didn't want its colonies to go, waged wars with them, so they gained their independence, and intentionally installed pretty incompetent government, which would be resisted by their people. So powers, very interested in Africa, still, they might have independence, but they're still largely under the thumb of major powers. And likewise, South and Southeast Asia largely kind of does develop a greater sense of independence, but still becomes very central to the culture. You see, as I mentioned, places like Vietnam, you see places like Cambodia, like Korea, all of these become very relevant places. And really, it's countries which largely stay out of the Cold War, including Indonesia, that managed to avoid much of the worst of it. So bear this in mind in the Cold War. I said there are three main regions of relevance: Eastern Europe, parts of Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. So, World War II does many things. One of the major things World War II does, it creates two new powers, USA and the USSR. The two countries which emerge really quite quickly, but they do so in very different ways. Now, most countries, including the did suffer economically a lot during the war. The USA is the one that is able to develop the fastest, and there are good reasons for that, which we'll come on to. The USSR also developed very rapidly economically, but it does it in a very different way, and in a much more government controlled way. These two countries become the two so-called superpowers. We tend to talk about the Cold War as having two superpowers. The word super really emphasizing just how much more powerful they are than everywhere else. Beforehand, people would talk about power. It would be, let's say, the European power, Britain, France, different points in history, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and so forth. Now we have superpowers. They are so much more powerful than everywhere else. They're what we call hegemonic. They are almost entirely dominant. So we have post-war bipolar world. The world divided into two. Remember the maps and material we discussed in the first class? Where I mentioned we often do end up dividing the world into ways. That could be in terms of developing worlds and developed worlds. It's very simplistic, but this is really very common, and this is true of this time as well. The world gets divided into two. counting non-aligned countries, which we see states in continental scale as well. What's really interesting about the United States and the USSR is they're huge. Two enormous territories by this point. USSR, though Russia is still the biggest country in the world, but the USSR was even bigger than Russia. At the time when the Baltic states, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and more, USSR. The United States also, incredibly large. Uses a good proportion of North America. So, with these two superpowers in the bipolar world, it makes sense that we have two major rivals. They are rivals, but they have different ideologies. USA, which is capitalism, free market, individualism, individual liberalism. Doesn't mean it's always a liberal country, but it has a liberal economic system, meaning that individuals should have the freedom to do what they want, which is very central to the American vision. So individuals should have the right to set up their own business, to make money, free of government interference, with taxation, relatively speaking, in the USA. So economically, a capitalist system. USSR is a communist system. State control, collectivized, unity-based, will largely share what they make. Agricultural system, the farmers share what they make. So very different economic systems, but crucially, also very different, very important military rivals. They see each other as a threat. They have a different view of what the planet should look like. And this is mutual suspicion and fear. And this is really magnified at the end of World War II, with two nuclear attacks on Japan. So USA tries to end the war with Japan, and it's successful in that regard by dropping atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what this done, the USA has almost unlimited power. If you mess with the USA, it might drop a bomb on you. It's a lot of terror, a lot of fear. And it soon turns out that the USSR also has this capacity. USSR also has the power to drop an atomic bomb on anywhere it wants, chooses to. This creates a lot of fear. You see that they're very powerful countries, not just in terms of economy, but crucially, they have this never seen before military power, ability to destroy somewhere they want to. Just to kind of reiterate and emphasize these points, what does the USA stand for? Well, maybe the most recognizable brand in the world. It is a free market capitalistic system. People should have the ability to trade freely and to make money without at least much government. A liberal democracy, people have the vote. People have individual rights. The government is elected by the people. Why not always like having parliamentary democracy? But if you're an adult, get a vote and a citizen. Only for me, by the way, I'm not a citizen. Okay. Freedom of opportunity and fiercely anti-communist. The USA hates communism. There is this huge purge of scare, communism, where anyone who is suspected of being communist. The Soviet Union is essentially anti-capitalist, state socialist, so the state is in charge. Everyone is theoretically equal. Anyone who is in a position of power is invested, taken down. The middle classes and wealthy classes are centrally planned economy. Government is in charge of developing new cities, new mines. It controls where farming takes place. It really has its eyes and ears everywhere. Also, lots of surveillance, really making sure that the government is in charge of everything. One, only a communist party. There's no other parties allowed. USA, you can theoretically create a new party if you want. Now, in reality, USA has for most of its history only had two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. It doesn't have switched as an ideology, but that's a separate. USSR, one party, just one party, the Communist Party. Other parties are banned, and it imposes this ideology on its satellite states as well. So, as we'll see, any country under the USSR's control, if anyone tries to resist the Communist Party, they will face a lot of problems. It's also workerist. In other words, workers come first. With the USA, very much kind of aspirational, very kind of focused on creating a middle class, creating a wealthy elite. Anyways, USSR is kind of the opposite. Now, workers come first. You'll be celebrated and rewarded if you're a good, hard-working person. You're working well in a mine, for example, or in a steel factory. But people who are kind of intelligentsia, the elite, are removed from society. So it's all about the government being trying to minimize. So what this results in is what we call the free world. It's three, not two, technically. The demographer studies population. He's French. His name is Alfred Sophie. He said in an article in 1952 that we divide the world into three. The first world are capitalist countries. These are generally democratic countries. So what you notice, hopefully, is this is largely North America on the whole, Western Europe, and then a few other places such as Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. These are the first world, according to him. The second world, maybe the one that we hear the least about now, are the communist countries. These are countries that aren't necessarily poor. So crucially, the second world doesn't have to be less affluent, less rich than the first world. It just has a communist system. So this is particularly USSR, as well as its Eastern European satellite states, that really kind of influences, plus China, and then eventually also places such as Vietnam and North Korea. So the communist countries make up the second world, and Cuba. And then finally, the third world is a much bigger group. And so he describes the third world as the exploited country. Meaning these are the countries always follow along what the first and the second world say. So they have much less autonomy, they have much less freedom to do what they want. They have their influence. They're still very poor. He also said there's another section of the third world called countries, which theologically don't agree really that much with either capitalism or communism and create a third one. Go between them. So these are the three world issues. And this becomes central to understanding the Cold War. First world, capitalist, second world, communist, third world, everyone else. Plus a number of Western European, especially Western European countries. These are capitalist, first world countries. First world, around the North Atlantic region, NATO. In response to NATO, USSR gave the Warsaw Pact. I'll mention a bit more in a minute. The Warsaw Pact, the sort of dark red, shows the USSR along with countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. These are countries under its law. So these are kind of the major organizations, and there are many other organizations too. Come to foundational. So this is out of 1980. As I mentioned, we also have the non-aligned states as well. Okay, what geopolitics all about in the Cold War? Really, it's about balance. Before nuclear, like nuclear warheads, everybody is now fearful because, as we saw in Japan, if a country like the USA, USSR, an atomic bomb on you, get that power, as long as it fly up. So people become very afraid, and this becomes known as MAD, Mission Assured Destruction. What this means is that if one country drops an atomic bomb on another nuclear power, they will retaliate and do the same. Outcome, both are annihilated. So if the USA decides to bomb the USSR, USSR will bomb the USA back, and eventually they'll just destroy each other. Likewise, if the USSR drops a bomb on the USA, USA will retaliate the USSR, and again, they'll keep on bombing each other until they eventually are destroyed. So this is a crisis. No, this is quite terrifying. Suddenly, people might be scared of an army soldiers coming in, but you can kind of see it coming. You can prepare for it. If someone decides to drop a bomb on you, there's not much you can do about it. It happens suddenly, and it's so unbelievably powerful. You have no chance of resisting it. So this leads to this huge fear. And at the same time, the USA and the USSR want to control as many territories as possible, and especially the strategic ones, that they can keep their missiles as near to their rival as possible. USSR wants to have somewhere nuclear bomb in the USA if it needs to. USA wants to have a territory where it can fire its own nuclear bombs, atomic bombs, and the USSR if the time comes and it needs to do that. So, what this cartoon said, those a bit blurry, both of them around the bombs, the signs say, oh, on no account be used, enemy might retaliate. So, on account to be used, but the retaliate. Okay, so I'll mention this as well. Non-aligned movement, especially in the 1950s, 1960s. The point of this is countries that don't want to align themselves either. They don't want to be involved in this. So India, Yugoslavia, these become two of the main non-aligned countries. Yugoslavia is very interesting because it is in Eastern Europe, but it decides it doesn't want to be the USSR state. It's a communist country, with a dictatorship, but it chooses not to be fully Soviet. India, in part of the British Empire, chooses not to be completely the again being on the line. And the movement really developed in 1955 with Indonesia and the conflict, well as an area of India, bringing together 29 countries, most of which were newly independent, who all agreed that they wanted to oppose colonialism and neo-colonialism and build economic cooperation between Asia and Africa. What we see here, a number of countries trying to cut out their own directions. They don't want to be involved in this, let's say, in the USSR. Sounds pretty scary. They don't feel ideologically strongly either way. So they choose instead to try and create their own union, NAM. We also see the rise gradually of China. So China has its own communist revolution and becomes originally close to the USSR. The two work together. The USSR helps show China how to develop a lot of its century plans. Later, by the 50s to 60s, they actually China at first is quite close to the USSR. By about 1963, China starts to think that the USSR actually took off this. really even more strongly communist than the USSR in some ways, and decides it wants a more aggressive policy than the Soviet Union to spread communism around the world. So, whereas the Soviets say that they need to disarm, actually end the nuclear war, China says, actually, I think we should continue this. They do improve their relations in the 70s. They're trying to change. Anyway, there's a number of important theories about and I'm going to come back to the heart. So remember what we said with the heart. You control Eastern Europe, according to the theory, but Eastern Europe is really central to the Cold War. It's on this principle, USA recognizes that if it's going to win the Cold War and create a pleasant society, it needs to involve these. At least it needs to stop communism spreading further than East. The Soviet Union, by this point, is controlling most of Eastern Europe, either directly by colonizing it. For example, the Baltic states, the USSR, legally they feel Latvia and Lithuania. They have an illegal treaty with Russia, which basically says the Soviet territory. But it also indirectly, semi-directly, Poland being Czechoslovakia because it installs communist government. USA doesn't want communism to spread further than these places. So it has to start creating. Part of what this is called domino theory. This cartoon demonstrates it quite well, I think. Dominoes, if you've ever played dominoes, where you have like little in a row, knock one over, they all fall over. Have you ever seen dominoes before? I'm familiar with dominoes. The dominoes, you knock one over, they go around. You get some quite cool ones where they kind of go uphill over as they go. This is the basis of this theory. If you knock one country over, if one country falls communism, every other country one by one. The USA develops this domino theory. You need to stop communism spreading. And the USA therefore develops a policy it calls T, the need to prevent communism spreading. This is US theory policy from 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. Harry S. Truman, fun fact, Harry S. Truman doesn't stand for anything, just but he didn't have a middle name. Truman is the president of the USA, and he wants to provide support because he's against authoritarian threats. Now, here's a little interesting story. He develops this theory and doctrine of the Greek Civil War. During this war, the USA gave support to the Greek government to fight communism because the UK said it wouldn't get involved. The UK was really struggling economically. A lot of its colonies get independence, such as India at this time, and didn't really want to be involved in Greece. But the USA decides we fund anti-communism in Greece because he thought that the USSR was spreading communism in Greece. The USSR actually wasn't involved at all. The USSR never did anything. But it shows the sort of paranoia, fear that Western countries have about the USSR. USA, which by the way, was quite an isolationist country. You didn't tend to get involved in other countries' business. Now the USA was getting involved. They're relatively small countries such as Greece. But containment occurred. Now, I showed you this map of Kinder's Harlem theory map. On the right, we have how containment develops. So we see the Kinder's theory is actually then applied in real life during the Cold War, especially in what become known as Finland. The real lands that surround the USSR. This is a more recent theory by Nicholas Spikeman, and he basically argues that the heartland isn't the most important territory. He says it isn't just Eastern Europe, actually anywhere around USSR, basically, is the most important region to control. So he calls this the Rimland, and therefore we see this present around the Soviet Union develop. And these are the countries which Western powers want to make sure don't fall. These Rimlands are quite hard to control in some ways. They're quite vulnerable. They have a lot of security problems. Why do they have security problems? Because they're in the middle. They have the capitalist country one side of them, and the communist country the other side. So they're always being pulled in two directions. The other issue they face is that they're surrounded by both water and land. So to have a military presence, you need to be able to be capable of climbing mountains and crossing the sea. So they're quite difficult to actually control. But the USA therefore looks at alliances with Rimland states, especially Turkey, certain parts of the Middle East, Afghanistan, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and it already has claimed very sneakily Baltic states, parts of sort of what's now Belarus, Moldova. So, USA trying to contain the Soviet Union, trying to stop communism spreading. Soviet Union, meanwhile, tries to strengthen by developing these buffer states. I mentioned this before, briefly, I'll mention it in more detail now. The Warsaw Pact. This is a direct response to NATO. The NATO, remember, is a North Atlantic treaty organization, brings together the USA and Canada with Western Europe. The USSR sees this as a threat. By the way, Russia, as a descendant of the USSR, still tends to see NATO as a threat. This is partly why Russia is so bothered about Ukraine, because Ukraine is NATO. The USSR develops its own pact, Warsaw Pact. There's 7 other East Bloc socialist countries, and we see the development of Iron Curtain, where we have a division between the NATO, non-aligned and neutral countries on the one hand, and the communist countries on the other hand. The communist countries were brought into the Soviet sphere of influence. But of course it leads to problems, because not everyone in these countries is with the government. What we see perhaps most famously in 1968, where Czechoslovakia, which is a relatively liberal country socially, most people in Czechoslovakia are quite liberal and don't like communism. Czechoslovakia attempts to develop its own liberal system. How does the Soviet Union respond? It invades it. The Soviet Union is scared that Czechoslovakia is going to become a liberal state, but it brings tanks into it, using its allies to help, and forcibly ends this liberal revolution in Czechoslovakia. Likewise, Hungary sees a revolution. So, basically what we're seeing in conclusion to this point, the Rimlands are really central. It's present around the Soviet Union, sees a huge amount of Cold War fighting, disagreement. So particularly Central and Eastern Europe, as I mentioned, going back to the Kinder theory, Eastern Europe, control the world. This is the centre of the Cold War, especially Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. These are 3 of the most tense countries at the time. Germany, as I mentioned, is split. Germany is partitioned into West Germany, which is capitalist, and East Germany, which is communist. Berlin is the capital. In the 50s, Korea becomes the next flashpoint. North Korea becomes a communist state under a one family rule. Kim family, completely in charge of North Korea, install perhaps the strongest communist system in the world, which remains to this day. South Korea becomes gradually it happens. You wouldn't say it happened immediately, but South Korea is now very much a country with a lot of Western alliances. It becomes very different. why North and South Korea so divided to this day. They have the DMZ, demilitarized zone. Can't cross from one to the other. South Korea can't go to North Korea. Vietnam becomes the next major flashpoint in the 60s to 70s. USA, as I mentioned, historically doesn't really put up the country defense up to around this point. It gets involved in Vietnam, has a terrible time. Really, bitter warfare. And Vietnam is again split into communist and capitalist parts. Afghanistan becomes another country which sees conflict around the 70s and 80s. Afghanistan, by the way, has long been really geopolitically and strategically important. British wanted to control Afghanistan when they controlled India. They saw that if you control Afghanistan, it protects Russia later recognizes that if it's going to be powerful in Central Asia, Afghanistan, which is Cold War. And then, lastly, Middle East. Really always quite relevant. Middle East is being petitioned anyway, but becomes another kind of central. Oh, I'm sorry, India and Pakistan. Pakistan, as I mentioned, gained independence together from Britain, but they developed very differently. Pakistan as a Muslim society, India as a secular society with a Hindu majority, they remain very bitter geopolitical rivals. They have very different perspectives about their alliances. So what's going on beyond the arm? I mentioned the arm England, but actually, the arm, most notably perhaps is Cuba. Cuba is a source of great fear for America because Cuba is right off the border of the USA. Cuba is only 90 miles away from the USA, Florida. 90 miles. You can shoot an atomic bomb very easily. Any other kinds of missile. Cuba is the Soviet Union installs a number of military weapons, installs missiles in Cuba, and points them towards the USA. This unsurprisingly terrifies America. It leads to a huge standoff between the two. So in the end, it ends quite peacefully. There was an invasion quite successful by the USA at one point at the Bay of Pigs, but eventually Kennedy, the American president, and Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, agree that the USSR will remove its missiles from Cuba as long as the USA A doesn't invade it, and B secretly, this wasn't publicized at the time, secretly the USA has to remove its own missiles from Turkey. Often forgotten in the Cuban Missile Crisis that the USA actually had its own missiles in Turkey pointing at the USSR. So again, this is why Turkey is so important. Somewhere near the USSR, it's somewhere which has American missiles. They're often forgotten how many wars were actually fought on the ground in countries. Because both the USA and the USSR are providing both financial and military support to groups that agree with their ideology. Now, Korea and Vietnam get a lot of attention. These are two of the main conflicts, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. But there were also countries, Nicaragua, Angola, Afghanistan, which also see a lot of fighting. In the case of Angola, one of the bloodiest wars in the 20th century, but often forgotten by much Western media, especially. What we're seeing in all of these wars is pro-communist groups, pro-capitalist groups, with the USA and the USSR providing all sorts of financial and military support. What they were really trying to do is install their own government. They wanted to install government. This map at the top shows the property wars at the time. You'll notice there are quite a few of them, and this includes some parts of Africa. So, although sometimes people the Cold War as being a bloodless war, The reality couldn't have been further from the truth. Many people did die during the war. Okay, okay. So we're coming toward the end. I want to give you another challenge. So please do your best with it. Some of these are harder than others, but I want to see if you can bring together what was discussed today and last week with mapping and politics and geopolitics and geostrategy. I'm going to present different maps, and I want you to see if you can interpret them. You can try and work out what message they're trying to give you. Think, for example, about anything that is unusual about these maps. Do they look a bit different from maps we're used to? Think about the choice of colours. Remember, for example, that red typically means communist. Think about the symbols and graphics. Think about what they include, but also exclude. And think about why they highlight certain things. I will let you talk to each other. Please do chat about it. And let us know when you have a possible answer. Here's the first map. It's published in Time magazine, American magazine, 1952. I hope it's big enough. I'm trying to blow it up a bit bigger for you. But you have an answer as to what it shows. Please, just put it.
Silakan ini berdiskusi dengan teman-temannya. Bagaimana sih ini di mapping ya, representasi dari warna peta itu atau settingnya itu berkaitan dengan apa? Berarti mungkin gambar ini representasinya seperti apa? Ini ada ada Europe, Afrika dengan warna yang berbeda. Silakan untuk berpendapat. Jelaskan warnanya, ada yang agak terus ada transisi dari berbagai.
Okay, I think that the east one is socialist and the middle is the transition and the west side is liberalism.
Very good. And I think it's interesting because we see it presented from. So we can see it actually, the map is being kind of turned on its side, right? I hope you see that. So instead of having north at the top, we actually have the west at the top. So you mentioned it really well. You know, we have kind of in the foreground at the bottom here, we have this kind of dark red communism, and we have this kind of paler red in Europe, really depicting places that are falling. They're not fully communist, they're becoming communist. Then we have the rest of the world, or the rest of Europe, out at the top, not communist. What impression do you get of this kind of transition? You know, it's like communist, a bit communist, not communist. Does it make you fearful maybe if you're not a communist? Makes sense?
It looks like the first part of the word present.
Yeah, I think we can kind of see this sort of spread. It makes it look quite threatening. See, communism is spreading through Eastern Europe. We have sort of the free state at the top of the map. And communism is kind of coming up, welling up almost from the ground. is about to like infect and showing that communism is dangerous. Bearing in mind it's an American magazine. But if anyone else has anything to say, thank you for sharing that. Anyone else got anything to say on that?
Ada lagi yang mau berpendapat?
If you give answers, a good way of engaging with the material, as some of you have done. So I think it's an unusual map. We're used to seeing maps where the north is at the top, south is at the bottom, west is on the left, and the right. This map shows Europe on its side. So it's basically giving the impression of Moscow. This Russia's what it's trying to say. You imagine like Russian eyes looking at Europe further away from Russia as more and more territory to try and turn to communism. So it seems quite threatening. It's meant to be showing that Russia is easily eyeing up Europe. And so the colour is interesting. So we see that the darkest red is used for the USSR, like communism, paler red, giving the impression that communism is seeping out of the USSR, it's gradually making Europe more communist. I have another map. One is a bit different. It's the British School Atlas. So you go to school in Britain in the 1950s, you might get a map such as this. Does anyone have any interpretation of this map? You can't read it, by the way, from where you're sitting. The dark purple kind of scarlet colour is NATO nations. The sort of next darkest shade is other US allies. Red, also pact nations, so the Soviet Union and its allies. And the pink, other US allies, so other communist nations. Anything unusual about this map in the first instance? What do you notice about the map? That's maybe a bit different from the usual map. Please have a go. Don't feel you'll be wrong. Any answer's good. How many of you have ever seen a map like this before? How many of you have never seen a map like this? Am I talking to myself?
So anyone to share?
Plus, it's more fun than people do. You want to hear me all the time.
Just wonder of seeing the word from the top, the North Pole, to represent the center of power, for example, Western allies and also Russian Empire. And whenever we see the like purple or the USSR, Europe, or the culture influence still felt until today before the application, still alphabet and also like the name of people. Like people from Croatia, Slovak Republic still like have a Russian influence.
So, Soviet. Croatia, I think, is more Western than usually. Like Asian. Soviet, definitely. Centric, really. Yeah, good answer. And I think part of what I want you to get to think about here is not necessarily for everyone, like trying to interpret it in huge detail. But maybe think almost emotionally, how would you feel? Think about who the audience is. This is aimed at British children. If you're a British school child, growing up in the Cold War, look at that map. How might it make you feel? You feel better or worse? Does this? You saw the previous map. The previous map of the Western map makes communism in Russia look really scary. Look at this map. Does Russia look so scary on this map? If you're British or American, does communism look easier to control or harder to control?
A little bit hard because they have like same size of
Yeah, I think that's it. And you mentioned it before in previous articles also that it really clearly divides the world into two. Like you can see we have the sort of Western world and we have the sort of USSR communist world. This map shows that. It crucially shows them as being fairly similar in size. The map before makes communism look like almost an uncontrollable force, about to just infect all of Europe. This map, I think, is more reassuring. At least that's how I read it. If you're living in USA or Canada, as well as Europe, Western Europe, you actually look about the same size as communist countries. It makes communism look a bit easier. It makes you look like equal at the very least. So I think it provides a bit of protection, insurance for children. Again, just think about the colours involved. Communist states are shown in red. It shows them in direct confrontation. It shows communism and capitalism vicious. And one side of the map, capitalist, one is communist. How often do you see a map which shows the North Pole at the centre? That's quite unusual. So it's very much like a top-down view of the globe. USSR is at the centre. It shows that it is at the heart of the heartland. Remember the Ireland theory? Showing that USSR is at the centre, and the centre of the Eurasian and Eastern European landmass. So it is showing it as powerful, reminding a viewer that the Soviet Union is a powerful force. But it also provides some reassurance, because it shows that North America is also powerful, because North America also near the centre. It's quite clever, I think. It manages to get both the USSR and North America in the centre of the map simultaneously. So we can see how they are two rival powers and kind of ability. I have quite a different one here. This one is maybe a bit harder, but it's still quite interesting. This is East German, therefore communist German, school against children in the 1970s. Just so you know, this is the hard account. It's basically showing transport routes. So, kind of major railways. I don't know if anyone has anything to say about that. But I think what's most important to think about for you on this map, both these maps, is what do these maps not show? These are showing transport networks in Germany, specifically East Germany. What do they not show? People work out what important feature of the maps ignoring.
Saya usulkan ada yang mau berpendapat lagi. PA itu menggambarkan tentang apa? Nah, di sini kalau di zaman modern kita ada ini ya, Poland, terus itu ada Czechoslovakia, terus juga Jerman Timur. Nah, untuk garis-garisnya itu lambangkan apa? Yang mau berpendapat silakan.
I think it symbolized some kind of think it was a gas, some kind of gas pipes. I think, like we know, like Russia is the largest natural gas resources, and they try to share it with their allied countries, the Warsaw Pact. And we know that Poland is, it used to be a Warsaw Pact and used to be communist. So I think Russia is kind of sharing those natural gases.
Good work, really good. So, as you say, what they're both showing is how connected, interconnected Europe is. Really celebrating the way how East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary are all closely connected to the USSR. They all help each other out. They spread the wealth, they spread resources, you mentioned gas, they're showing transportation, they're showing railways. It's showing Eastern Europe as being united, right? They all are connected. Eastern Europe is a connected, all under a communist mission. They're not shown at all. There's something completely wrong. It implies irrelevant of time. I hope you'll notice it. How much detail does it show Western Europe as having? West Germany, Austria. How much detail do you feel West Germany, for example? As part of Germany. If you were a school child, wanted to learn about West Germany, get that map. What do you learn about West Germany? Nothing at all. Completely pointless, irrelevant, right? Quite clever. When you think about it, it's quite clever. So it's East Germany, as you correctly said, as being connected to the Soviet Union and to other communist satellite states. In fact, East Europe really interconnected, cooperative, help each other out. West Germany, West Europe, nothing there. You don't even need to know. Who cares? Basically what it's implying. Who cares what happens in Western Europe? It's irrelevant. There's nothing there that you need to know about. So think about that as well. What do you think that's for? This map completely ignores Western Europe. It says it doesn't matter. It's all about Eastern Europe. So the connections between the communist satellite states and the USSR are quite clear. There's very little connection to Western Europe. But one railway line on the map on the left of Germany is all it shows. That only detail it shows about Western Europe. Germany completely blank. It doesn't even get a name. That doesn't even name Western. It's completely ignored, implying there's less of an interest. And interestingly, by the way, modern maps of Eastern Europe tend to emphasize these countries' ties to the West. So if you were to go to school in Eastern Europe today, most maps you get will actually show the opposite. They'll show the connections to Western Europe, and they'll ignore Russia much of the time. Again, kind of showing how Eastern Europe is the heartland, how people tend to really control it by grabbing it from themselves in a way. And this is very central in the current geopolitics in Eastern Europe. Somewhere like Ukraine, for example, is on the whole a very much European, Western European country, but you wouldn't always believe that representation of it by Russia in reality does. One of time, so I can sort of highlight one or two that I can talk about. Second class today will be shorter, so I think probably that's fine. A couple of other maps. So this is a Life magazine map from 1953, so also America. This is a really weird map. It kind of looks like at first, I think, is that Western Europe has these like tentacles, octopus or something like that, grabbing into Eastern Europe. That's actually not what it's implying. is a fairly critical view of European policy. First of all, notice the barbed wire fence. So it shows, again, communism in red. So remember, communism almost always red. A barbed wire set cannot cross it. Okay, called the iron curtain, cannot cross it. And we have different symbols representing military force, therefore danger. We see Eastern Europe has things such as tanks. It also has factories. It looks quite ugly, right? It doesn't look a very nice place. Factories, polluting factories and tanks. So it makes Eastern Europe look undesirable. It also has these flows to represent and also threat. But what's weird is it looks a bit like the West is penetrating into the East. What it's actually meant to be doing is this is the USA using its Western European ally of supporting the East. It's actually USA saying to Western Europe, are you supporting Eastern Europe? Are you funding their military industrial complex? Really odd, by the way, for me in this map, is how it doesn't actually present that much in Western Europe at all. It really emphasizes Antwerp and Belgium. It's a bit of an odd place to pick out. Antwerp is largely like diamond cutting. It's somewhere which has a diamond history, but I'm not aware, and it's a port. I'm not aware of having a huge amount of kind of elements to German Polish ports. So kind of an interesting. It does show Zurich in Switzerland, a kind of finance centre, a banking capital. It's basically an American accusation of the West. This is the final map. I like this one. It's a bit small, but it's very satirical. Republicans and other real Americans. Very similar. California is separated. The nation was actually from California, but California is Democrat. And then it has in the Northeast, Democrats and welfare basically being rude and saying that people in the elite part of the USA are somehow communist sympathizers. But the USSR is called godless communists, liars and spies, very rude about the USSR. It also shows some other details on the world. So the Middle East is oil. China is split into two. It has a huge Taiwan. The Taiwan is called our China. People's Republic of China is about the same size. Obviously, very wrong in reality. Their China. It shows basically this distortion about how interested America is in different countries, or continents. So you can see South America, Australia, and especially Africa are tiny, implying that Americans just don't care about them. Instead, all America really cares about are itself, USSR, and the Middle East. Basically, the only places that the USA is really that good about. It's quite kind about the UK. It weighs way bigger than it is as well. But that's because the British Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher, who's very friendly with Ronald Reagan. So, some interesting points. And it's basically kind of playing on the fact that most Americans are very ignorant about the rest of the world. American Party, it's actually playing on the idea that Americans just don't know anything about them unless they have an correction. I will just finish this. I think it's like 1 or 2 slides and then I hit phase. Number of anti-communist revolutions in Eastern Europe. Solidarity was in Poland. Trade unionist group. Basically, trade unionists rise up against leadership. Baltic Way is really fascinating. This is where people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania literally hold hands, connecting themselves across the entirety of the three countries. So it's a big demonstration of Baltic unity against communism. It's also called the singing revolution because these countries have a famous tradition of singing. They will sing these nationalistic patriotic. 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. It kind of comes down by accident. There's a report that it's going to be taken down and people start cancelling it. In a sense, it was actually created, but nevertheless, falls in 1989. So finally, Berlin, the capital of Germany, is united once again. USSR, I mentioned, all sorts of economic problems. Also Chernobyl, the great Chernobyl nuclear disaster, 1986. Very interesting, the whole story, by the way, because it occurred and the Soviet Union tries to pretend nothing happened. And because there was so little Western get out of the USSR, you might never have known until decades later that a Swedish nuclear power plant started getting weird data around the same time. Found that there was all these typical kind of like Soviet chemicals in the air, and worked out that